So one of the things that if we look at this, then we can start to see, root cause identification of a problem is critical for users. And one of these that's it's pretty interesting I find a lot is people don't necessarily do this as well as they should. And one of these is with this user agent. And I've had a couple people sort of say, I can't believe that people don't detect this. And I see probably in about 8 out of 10 site rebuilds, people aren't doing this. They're not really looking for something as simple as blocking the search engines. And I had a case where I got a call one day from a very large brand. They said, hey, we rebuilt our site. We've been trying, we don't get any traffic from Google anymore. We were. One consultant told us that we were probably banned from the search engine. A ban and a rebuild sort of don't really go together unless you did something really dodgy with that. They said, and Jess, if you go to the next slide, they had spent about 1.7 million in paid search trying to recover the gap from the missed opportunity or missed traffic from organic. So immediately, since they said it was a rebuild, I looked at the robot's text. I saw the block was in place. Now I have a dilemma as a consultant. Do I tell them what it is for free? How do I charge them for that information, especially since other people didn't detect it? And so I just simply said, hey, I can tell you right now what's wrong, but I just don't know how to charge you. And he's like, look, if you can solve this problem, I'll give you my full agency business for search. And so I gave him the answer. He fixed it. Things improved. And then we become the agency of record for that company. Not only that company, but the next company, which combined generated about 3.6 million in revenue for my agency. So a very simple problem that it was interesting that other people hadn't detected became a very big opportunity for us. So don't want to underestimate that whole process of root cause. Why are certain things happening? And if you go to the next slide, other recent crawl blocks that I've seen, I think we're actually starting to get either less sophisticated or more sophisticated. The one on the left was someone had simply copied and pasted a robot's text file and then put it over onto their website. And what they did when they did it, if you notice, Google's is missing. So they had completely dropped out of Google after a rebuild, and all it was because when somebody copied and pasted something, they missed Google, which was the first entry in the file. So something very similar to actually blocking it was leaving something off. And the one we're seeing more is the one on the right, where we have these web application exceptions, where this is happening with a lot of e-commerce tools where they're trying to detect scrapers or people that are looking at pages at a tempo that doesn't match a human. And so what we have to do is go in and actually put exemptions into these tools so that the search engines can actually get to those pages. So I think this sets us up for our first poll question. We just want to know, before we go into the next section, do you monitor your inclusion rate? How many pages you have in the search engines? It's a simple yes or no question.
Great. So I've just launched the poll. If everyone could just take a moment to fill in. It's a really simple yes or no answer. So just take a second. And again, thanks everyone for hanging in there while we took care of the technical difficulties. It's going a lot smoother now. So thanks a lot, Bill. Appreciate your patience. So do you monitor your inclusion rate? Yes or no? We're at 66%. Let's try to hit 75. I'll do a countdown. 5, 4, 3. Okay, this is almost your last chance. If you haven't clicked, click now. 2, 1. And closing the poll at 75%. Here are the results. So pretty close.
So it's pretty interesting. Yeah, it's pretty close. 56% don't. So I guess that's the perfect segue into actually the next slide, which is that, how to maximize your inclusion. And so, if 56% of us are not monitoring our index rates, and I'm going to show you how you can do that, sort of the poor man's way of doing it. But this first example was a site where I specifically, we fixed this and increased by 58%. And if you look at this slide, we see here two things. One, we always ask the customer the question, how many pages do you have? And their answer was, we have about 50 million pages on our website. What was interesting in this case, the first thing we noticed was that there was only 12.6 million in the sitemap. So because there was only 12.6, where's the rest of them? You know, where is the other 47.4 million pages? And they had no idea. They thought their tool was building all of them. The second thing that we found was of these sitemaps, 14.6 million errors. Now, the one thing we have to pay attention to with XML errors is that because we're feeding that to the search engine, and every time we feed them junk, there's a problem with that. If they come to a page and it's broken, if it redirects, all of those are wasted resources for the engine. And it's interesting when I present this, some people have told me, well, we expect Google to be able to figure that out. They've got all of this horsepower. They could gladfully take your 404 errors, gladfully take your redirects, but why do they need to? And so that's the one thing you want to monitor. And both Google, Bing, and Yandex have said they usually use a threshold of about 1% error rate to determine if they want to look at those pages. And we'll see an example later whereby simply, we had the first three pages actually had a problem. And by fixing that, you're able to get more pages indexed. So on the next slide, this is an example where I was doing a project for a global company. I was actually there speaking at their event. They asked me, did I see any particular problems? And my answer was, I didn't seem like you were indexed in many markets. And so we simply, as we were building an href language for them, which is telling Google that, hey, this is my French page, my German page, and things like that, we noticed that about 74% of all their pages were not indexed in the search engine. And we literally took their XML sitemap, checked it against what was indexed, and then from there found out that they were missing 74%. Now, if 74% of the pages aren't indexed, that's 74% that can't be scored. And if they can't be scored, you can't rank. And it was very interesting as we fixed a lot of these problems, which are simply getting rid of the extraneous errors. On the next slide, we see what started to happen. So over the next 30 to 60 days, one of the things that started to happen is every single market, now nothing else was done. No on-page optimization, no link building, no nothing. We had a 50% increase in traffic from organic search just by getting those pages indexed in the different markets. And so that's why, for the, was it 46 or 44% of people that are looking at this, it's easy for you to detect these kind of problems. For those that aren't, I'd strongly recommend that you take a look at this because it is a really effective way to increase traffic without a lot of the other things. Now, once you fix this, those magical traffic gains sort of go away. Now it's back to the regular stuff with SEO. And so one of the easiest ways for you to check index rates on the next slide is simply look at what Google is telling you that they have. Now, two things with this slide. Number one, almost every single country in this particular case have the same number of pages. And of this, we see that, for example, for Brazil, 549 pages we submitted on our XML sitemap, and only 42 were indexed. Now, this is not completely accurate. There may be more pages, less pages, but it is a free tool that we can use. The second thing I want to point out are the issues. Notice that almost every single country, there was 3 errors. And that's really what caught my attention in this particular case, is why does every single country have 3 errors? Some have a few more. But what we noticed is really the first 3 files that were in the XML sitemaps were files that actually were redirecting somewhere else. There was a URL and it was redirecting elsewhere. So imagine if you're Google, you come in, the first 3 that you check, you go to retrieve are actually redirecting. It's a high probability that more of them in that file. And because it was the first 3 specifically, it does give them a decent indication that there's probably more. And what we found is once those 3 errors were fixed, there was many more, but once all the errors were fixed and Google was not getting problem pages anymore, they started to crawl the site much more aggressively and the pages were indexed. So again, just simply using Google Search Console you're able to see that. Now, the second problem we have with indexing on the next slide is really aligning to the correct country. Now, this is not a new problem. This is a problem that we can't even really detect because most of our ranking tools that we use will show that we're ranking well in another, but doesn't necessarily tell us it's the right page. And so this is a case where we fixed this for a company, and just by simply fixing their href language, we were able to, they generated about $8 million in incremental revenue. And so on the next slide, if we look at the exact picture of what I'm talking about, I was speaking at a conference in Australia, and I was using a little, MiFi card, and somebody asked me, what it was, where I got it, and I told them we simply sat down, went to Google, put in Huawei 3G wireless router, and what popped up, ranking number one, as it should, it's a branded query. They're ranking number one, but notice it's the global English page. Now, on the global English page is the first picture to the right, is showing that we can only learn about the product because it's global, there's pricing issues, there's availability issues. But however, if the Australia page, for the very same page, but specific to Australia, I can buy now. And so if this is your case, your tools might be telling you your ranking, but is it the Australia page? Is it the France page? Is it a UK page? And this is specifically problematic in languages that are duplicate around the world. So English, Spanish, German, French are the biggest problems with this. And so one of the things we want to do is really make sure that this is right, that we use the href language to tell them, hey, this is my French one, my French France one, this is my French Belgian, my French Canadian, because they may not always detect that. The second thing they may not detect is your dominant site. So your US site or your UK site in English may have more links, may have all those good things from an SEO perspective, and they take that just because of those properties. And so simply setting the href language, whether in page or using an XML sitemap, allows us to tell them what it is. And we're seeing results as quickly as 48 hours after doing this. And on the next slide, this is where we start to run into problems. Now, we get a lot of people that come to me at a conference or email me and said, hey, I go into Search Console and there's a gazillion errors. Google's not mapping that. And one of the things we see a lot is a lot of people get lazy when they go global. In this particular case, what this company did was they simply cloned their Spain site and made it their Argentina and made it their Colombia site. Now, notice in this screen capture, we detected out of 4,900 pages, 4,442 of them had a canonical problem, meaning the URL that was on the XML sitemap or that was submitted was actually pointing somewhere else. In this case, they cloned the page, used some Java application to change pricing, but what they forgot to do was remove the canonical to the Spain page. And so all these markets that they cloned, thinking they were taking the easy way around launching global, all had this problem. So the vast majority of the pages that were being submitted in the href XML were actually producing an error. So because Google wasn't picking up these pages and wasn't reading the XML, they ended up with a significant number of errors in Google Search Console. So what happens when you fix this, when you get the href language correctly, in place? Now, if you go to the next slide, this is an example where this company was mapping everything and lumping South America into one big tracking. We can see that over this period of time, which was 90 days, we had a 200% increase in organic traffic. Only because we didn't optimize anything. There was no links done. There was no on-page changes. It was just simply setting it so that the right page was ranking. So again, you can rank number one, and let's say you're Peru, but you see a page ranking for Chile or maybe for Spain. And we see almost every single market, once the right page started to show up, there was a pretty significant increase in traffic to those markets. And when you have this problem, if you go to the next slide, it typically looks like this, where 7.7 million href language tags were submitted. and 580,000 of them were actually had errors. And the problem with this is because the sitemaps that they were included in weren't being indexed. And you can see that if you go to the next slide, the very next thing we did when we see this kind of error is go over to, again, in Search Console, simply click the XML sitemap file, and we can see that very few of the pages had been indexed. And we started diagnosing the problem. We saw that almost every single country's file had a significant amount of errors. And so again, same thing we've done in the other cases, clean out the errors, get the pages to be indexed without wasting the search engine's resources, and you start to see these errors go away. Because if they can't get to the XML sitemap or the point in the XML sitemap that says, here's my other country versions of this page, they obviously can't map it. And that's why we end up with so many of these errors in Search Console related to the href language. The other big problem we're seeing is that there's a lot of people on the next page that are reading things on blogs and either aren't sitting back and saying, does this really make sense? Or taking it sort of at face value. And that same conference I was speaking at in Australia, the photographer taking pictures at the event came up and said, hey, I was in a meeting and I heard, the manager saying that they've lost almost all their traffic from around the world. And can you please take a look? And I opened up the code to the Australian page, and I noticed that they have href language in there, all nice and neat. But the problem is that they have the canonical tag back to the global site. And there's a couple of blog posts out there that actually tell you this is what you should do. This is 100% incorrect. And think about it for a moment, outside of any kind of href. If I set a canonical saying, hey, search engine, yeah, you found this page, but I'd actually like you to index this page instead. So imagine coming to your Australia or your UK homepage to find a tag that says, no, not this one, go get this one over here. So when you read some of this stuff online, take a moment to think, does that really make sense? Does it sort of go against what I know about this particular type of tag or this particular implementation? And so that's, we're seeing a lot of these index problems just come from either a lack of not looking at things, not testing things, or not using, in some cases, common sense on how they code things, just using it blindly. And many times that comes from our development teams going out and looking for things on the web. So that's really the first part of this webinar, was to talk about those indexing things. The second one, and actually leads us to our next poll question, which is what we said we were going to talk about, is do you spend time trying to match customer inquiries to content? So meaning, yes, you take and look at a query, why are people doing that particular query, and what kind of content should I present to them based on that query? So yes or no, go ahead and choose whichever one works for your particular situation.
Thanks, Bill. And we've had about 60% of you vote thus far. So I'll just do this one really quickly. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, final chance, and I'll be closing the poll. And here are the results. 82%.
That's great. So that's I think that those of you that aren't, definitely take a look at this, and then seriously ask the question. If we go to the next slide, what are people looking for, and how do we actually match them to that particular query? And in this particular case, I was in a meeting where the goal was to, have an increase in leads to the site. And no one really thought about having the search team. I just happened to be in the room after another meeting, and they started talking about this, and said, well, what about search driving traffic? And so we were able to, by having a 500% increase in organic traffic, by focusing on the query and why they did the query, being able to achieve an increase in leads as a result of that. If you go to the next slide, we created this target matrix, and I think most people will do something like this where, hey, here's a set of words, here's the query volume. For probably 20 years, I've been talking about missed opportunity matrix, where here's how many queries, here's how much we get. If we can get that, all kinds of good stuff happens. And so what we started to think about is, well, which of these do we go after? we're inclined to go after the top 50 queries because they are the top 50. But we said, wait a minute, we're trying to achieve leads. So does it make sense? If you go to the next slide, what we looked at was where do we start? And the first place that we start, and this has a build, Jess. Number one was we went after the list of ideas. So these were people that were specifically looking for lists of things. So a list of 10 or the top 50 things. We chose this because two reasons. One, there was 11 keywords, so easy to work with. Two, it was our second biggest conversion rate when we looked at what phrases and what page we're converting. Number two, we're assets with, meaning things that had this. So if you're selling laptops, then it might be, give me a laptop with a 1 terabyte. If you're a drink site, it might be drinks with this particular thing. And then third was the top 50 because it's the biggest. But notice that we looked at our end goal, which was leads. Which of these? Now, we're tackling all of these categories, but really tried to prioritize this. And by prioritizing this, it allowed us to see some interesting things. If you go to the next slide, we had a couple criteria. We started looking at the first thing we saw is many of these things with, while we were ranking well, they had bad snippets. People wanted this and this, and I'll show you an example of how we broke one of these down coming up. The second thing we found was that a lot of the queries were mobile and location based, which changed what we needed to present. And we also had 3 clusters that resulted in a high app download, which totally bypassed the ECRM system. And by bypassing that, we weren't going to get credit for it. So we skipped over those as well. So going to the next slide, some of the lowest hanging fruit were words where we identified that we were ranking 1, 2, or 3, but getting a relatively low click rate for that ranking. So in this case, this was a query, drinks with triple sec. Ranking number 3, a 1.69 click rate, not bad. We'd probably kill for that sometimes in paid search. And what we did notice is that people coming to this page did look at multiple page views. And like I said, almost a 2% went into the ECRM. So I just simply said, what do people want when they do this query? And if you go to the next slide, we created a little pie chart. So we took all the queries, put them into, tagged them as to what category they were in, created a pie chart to make it sort of MBA proof. And really what we found was cocktails with triple sec, drinks with triple sec were, about 50% of the query volume. So people didn't necessarily want to know what triple sec was, but wanted to know what to do with it. Now, still, since people wanted to know what it is, we had to keep that in there. So if we go to the next slide, we could show how we changed the snippet from before and after. So before we had sort of the Wikipedia-ish description, meaning triple distilled, triple sec is a term. People are bored already, which is why we were getting a low click rate. And we simply said, hey, they want to know very quickly what it is, but what's it in? And so by saying, hey, it's an orange flavored liqueur used in cocktails like these, what we found was that the click rate went up exponentially. So if we go to the next slide, we went from that 1.69 click-through rate to a 14.81% click rate, which yielded about 20,000 additional visits. Again, we were ranking number 3, so we didn't do anything other than change. In this case, we changed the meta description because the way the page was built, it was a little hard to tweak the page. Because we believe, because of all these incremental clicks, we actually moved from number 3 to number 1. You take, what you want from that, but we are seeing that when we have more clicks, and it's very relevant. This approach has also really helped with answer boxes. We had a 10 times increase in drink of the week signup, which was the goal, but the bonus was this snippet was used for multiple other phrases, which, in itself brought a significant amount of incremental traffic to the site. So this was one snippet, one result that from a high ranking page that really showed how things, one little simple change can do good stuff. So how do you do this? How do you replicate some of these finding snippets to optimize? Well, the first thing you do is go into Search Console, go into the search metrics, sort by impressions, and then I just go down the list. So I've identified 4 here for this particular client. for them to work on. The number one was obviously their brand name. And the first question I asked is, isn't it odd that 29% of the people who are searching for your brand name click through? What are the other 71% doing? And they looked puzzled, and it's like, I don't know. And they never reversed that number. So 30% is awesome, but 70% not clicking you when they want you seems pretty odd. And it turned out that their description in this particular case just had a bunch of countries because there was no meta description, there was no content on the page for Google to take to make a description. So very simple one to fix. Some of the others were ranking well, but getting a low click rate. We fixed the snippet. The net of this is by fixing just these four, fixing the home page and then fixing these other three deeper page snippets, resulted in an increase, $37,000 increase in revenue in the first week. So, very simple things by changing meta descriptions, and it's not sexy or compelling, is something that I think you should definitely take a look at. So in wrapping up, because we definitely want to get to some of your questions, the three takeaways are really understand the importance of indexability. Don't forget about your global opportunity if you are a global site and thinking of things like href language, and really accept that searcher intent is critical to success. Something as simple as listing drinks or referencing drinks in this case was a pretty significant increase in click rates. And while we might have a brilliant page that we've tuned, that gateway, getting them to come through the door and actually come in to look at the brilliant content that you've created can often be a barrier, and it can also be one of these real career makers, because I guarantee if you start showing some of this increase in traffic and sales as a result of something like this, management definitely notices it. So I think that's, what we tried to present. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties, and I'll turn it back to Lauren to pick some questions, and I'll do my best to answer them for you.
No problem. Thanks so much, Bill. And that was a great save there in terms of us getting that back rolling again. So fantastic. First question that comes in is from Martin. Martin asks, he's constantly being asked by clients how to determine the uplift after making structural modifications, implementing microdata, AMP, etc. So it sounds like Martin is being asked by clients, well, what's going to be the result and how can we track it after making a lot of these changes, or introducing these changes that he's suggesting to probably their development teams, et cetera, et cetera. And what would be the best way to gauge the increase from these types of initiatives?
Quite honestly, make a scientific wild ass guess and then hope it worked. No, seriously, it's almost impossible for us to do that. And as Martin has teed it up, doing multiple things at the same time, it's really hard to show lift. But the rule that I've always used, and I've had this in big companies where if you can't show a dollar amount, they won't spend a dollar to do it. And what we've tried to do is say, look, here's where we're at today. So if you believe, Martin, if you're going to use AMP, and AMP's going to get you some, ranking better, which it actually is doing well for a lot of people. You might rank number 7 in mobile, but with an AMP page, it actually jumps up higher if there aren't other better AMP pages. So we've been able to show things like that with doing a couple cases that if we can move something from, say, page 2 to page 1, specifically page 5, we're trying in a tool that I built, we're able to show that rank to click curve. That's usually the safest thing, that if you can get to the top 3, I try to say maybe a 5% increase in traffic, and then your recommendations, those 4 or 5 things that you want them to do, would lead to that movement from second page or bottom of the first page to top 3, and what's the 5% lift, and then simply fill in the rest of their conversion elements. It's about the closest we can get. And then what I try to do is make sure people are aware that when we, if they fail to do any of those pieces, that's the great little get out of jail free card, is that if they only do 3 of your 10 recommendations and your model was based on them doing all 10, if you get any kind of lift, that often helps you. It's an imperfect science, but it is one where you can at least sort of fake it till you make it type. It's believable data, but you will have to back it up with sort of an OBS type model. Just continue to show that the traffic. In this case of snippets, it's very easy to do. If you're in the top 3 and you have a bad snippet, I would think you could at least get a 5% increase by just simply having a better snippet. Those are some easy ones. Those are some easy candy to give to people and then allow them to trust you to be able to make some of the other bigger changes you need to do.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Next question comes from Parth. Parth asks, is there a way to basically speed up the indexing of once a site has changed their URL structure? And once that's done, how long should the redirects be in place?
That's 3 in 1. So I like how you snuck 3 questions in there. So number 1 is, so how do we speed it up? So 2 things I do on a site migration. Number 1 is I refresh my old XML sitemap. So I'm assuming you went from, say, this CMS to this CMS and the URL structure had to change. So one thing I do is I keep my old XML sitemap, but I make some change to it. So Google has said, I think informally, that this works. They're probably not going to tell you officially it does. We remove URLs from, we either add URLs to or remove URLs from the file to make it look like a totally new file. Now, Google will come get those. Now, this just violates everything I just told you about having a clean XML sitemap. Google will start to find those redirects. Sometimes they'll bail. Other times, if you've, at the same time you have a brand new one with all the new URLs, just make sure, absolutely positively make sure that there's no errors in that. So take that XML sitemap, pull it into Screaming Frog. I have a tool I built that nobody actually uses, but Screaming Frog does a great job. Import that file and any kind of errors, clean them up, and you'll find that plus creating a bunch of smaller XML sitemaps, like one for each area of business, is a great way to improve getting those in there. I'm trying to remember what the other 2 were. So that was speeding it up, and then just cleaning it up after a migration is exactly that. If you had a lot of garbage before, get rid of that and make sure you've got the clean sitemap. And I find that they start picking that stuff up very quickly. Now, if you had sort of a not a great site before that wasn't really visited, that same thing's going to happen probably for the new version. But if you had a moderately successful site where they were visiting fairly often, just cleaning up make sure the new sitemap is clean, fetch it, do a fetch of some key URLs, and we find that they'll rip through that content fairly quickly. Usually within 5 days, we can get 60 to 80% of the new content re-indexed.
Yeah, another thing too is I like to use the site migration as an excuse to get, like you said, everything fixed, right? All the trash picked up. So one thing is that's a great opportunity to be able to fix any 301 redirects which are unneeded. So a lot of the times you'll just find 301 redirects that are legacy, that the site has changed or a subdirectory URL slug has changed. So instead of hard code changing all of the links within the site itself, they still go through old 301s. And by eliminating the unneeded 301s and unneeded redirects and just changing those to direct links, then it seems that Google does a better job of picking up the exact redirects it should be following and finding the new locations as well.
Yeah, just don't waste their time. Give them something that's new and meaty, and that's the best thing. Make sure there's 0 or as few errors as you can possibly have it. And until you fix other parts of the site, then just go ahead and submit one with 1,000 pages or 100 pages that are absolutely correct, and then keep appending it as you're able to fix some of those. But again, the site migration is a perfect time to do that, is to get rid of all that junk.
Here's a question you're going to love. The client doesn't allow access to Google Analytics. So is there any way to measure index rate on secondary platforms, such as SEMrush or other tools?
To Search Console, they don't let you have access to, because that's not. Yeah, so it'd be Search Console. Well, I mean, for me, I would never work with somebody that wouldn't allow me to have access to that. But yeah, the other thing you can do is there's a couple tools. I have one, but I try not to promote it because Google's against tools that do this. But if you Google some Google index checkers, there's a couple tools. I think one's free, and I think there's another that's got some nominal charge. The one that's free actually doesn't use proxies. It's using an API that allows you to check that. That's one way to do it. The poor man's way is obviously use an info colon request. You're not going to do that for everything, but I would definitely check that for mission critical pages, category pages, and things like that. What's interesting when you do that, and if you see a different URL, you request this URL and a different one shows that you have some sort of canonical problem between those. So yeah, that's really the only way. Search Console is not completely accurate, but it's really the only thing that's available free. We have our index checker. You dump the XML sitemap of the URLs in, and then it goes out and checks to see. It actually tells you using the info colon what it, is it in there? Is there any canonical mismatches, or is there a date? The other thing you can use, poor man way, if you don't have access to Search Console, you may not have access to visit logs. Visit logs, then using some sort of log analyzer is another great way, because clearly if Google or Bing or anybody's fetched the page, there's a good chance that it's been there. And I think there's a couple people I've seen building tools, to try to do that. They check to see, and then will tell you what the frequency of the request rate is by Google specifically at a page level. I think Botify and a couple other tools are starting to do this. So those are ways outside of not having access to Search Console to do it.
Great, thank you. Next couple of questions are hreflang oriented, which always do bring up a lot of questions. So the first one is, a lot of the examples they see online are for one root domain, and then the various nations or locations broken out in folders. So the hreflang always stays within the same domain structure. But what do you suggest for sites that are using a .com, .co.uk, .com.au, etc., for building out their international presences?
So if you go to hrefbuilder.com and go to the blog, there's some examples of that. And based on this question and 4 projects I'm working on right now, I will update that to make sure we have it. So most people will tell you that with a top-level domain, .co.uk, .com.au, that you actually don't need to use it, because Google implicitly knows that that's a UK site. That's somewhat true. We find a lot of examples of this that it's not true, which is probably what you're seeing as well. So it's treated the same way. And the problem is all the free tools, they don't have an ability to parse at the URL level. So, within, and I'll plug my tool, hrefbuilder, we actually trim out the domain, all of that. We can set the regex to just look for the actual page path. However you've done it, whether you're using a top-level domain or .com country language, or just as a factoid, there's about 258 different ways people have sort of created their country language combinations. But yes, you can absolutely do it. And all you have to do is map it to a root level. Now, where it gets a little complicated is, where do you put those XML sitemaps? So let's say 10 of your sites are .com country language, another 10 are ccTLDs. So on the .com, you can actually put all those files nice and neatly in the root of the .com and point to them using an index file. If your ccTLD version, so the .co.uk, those you have to make 2 choices. The easiest option is to put those into the root of the .co.uk, that one only, and then submit it, and then Google will sort of make the connections across. The other way, because it's a pain to upload that into all these different locations, you can actually put a reference in your robots text file to say, hey, the index file or my XML sitemap from my UK, my Australia top level domains are actually over here in the .com, or the reverse. You can put everything in the .co.uk, but every single location site where the URLs are not put in that site's root, you have to have the robots text file telling the search engine that they're actually on another domain. Now that domain actually has to be validated inside of Search Console. It used to be we would do, you could do a DNS verification, which I strongly recommend. But you could also, if you do it in Search Console, they're recognizing that. So we're doing that quite a bit now, especially people that have blended. Either they're coming off of CCTLDs or they're moving to CCLDs because everybody says that's the thing to do. So whatever combination you have, just structure it and then put them in their respective places and point to them.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have a couple minutes left, so I'll move on to a no index question. So Jonathan writes, they have a ton of pages that they no index, no followed, basically because they felt that having their secondary search result pages, so basically it sounds like they had their product search or content search or whatever open for indexing. They go no index them because they were suffering in ranking, and then they recovered. Now, should they look at indexing those again? And if so, is there a process that you would recommend to opening them back up, even if they don't have a ton of unique content on them, because they feel that there were a lot of long tail terms and long tail search queries that could be ranked for those search pages. So after no indexing the whole entire database of page results, how would you determine which to let back into Google?
So first, they're clearly not Martin's client because they would want some massive 900-page case study on what's the impact of doing this. So first thing I do is I test a section of it. I wouldn't go to n layers. The reason is because, again, we're running into a diminishing returns to Google or any search engine. And what we want to do is, what's the next layer down that we could do? Something that we're reasonably sure we're going to get a good bunch of results for. Because what I find with a lot of these sites like this that have 14 different parameters you can assign, like apartment sites are notorious for this. So they have it with a fireplace, without, pet friendly, with a balcony or whatever. And for every one of these parameters that you check that a URL can be constructed from, is there content for it? And the fact that somebody's going to do that super long tail permutation, probably not going to happen. So the two things I would do is I'd look at my data and see, are there enough permutations or a section that I can test this on? Can I constrain it to just 1, 2, maybe 3 layers deep and not down to 15 permutations? Test that first and see what the impact is. Again, it's absolutely critical that you not have a lot of garbage in there. So if you're constantly swapping out inventory and these could return pages with nothing found, if you've got sophistication on your CMS where if there's no results found, then that's written dynamically and no index, no follow. I would definitely do that dynamically so that those pages will always be skipped over. Second, I would take that section that you're testing and make sure it's in a totally different XML sitemap. Third, I would try to limit the size of your XML sitemap to about 10,000 URLs each and randomize them. So whenever you're dumping a lot of sort of permeated content in, if it's, this one, blue one, size XL, green one, size, small, that's a pattern that's pretty easily seen that looks like there's a lot of non-relevant content potentially coming in this file. So by randomizing that a little bit, you don't have that sequential set of data that looks like it's just a bunch of stuff that's not really worthwhile to the search engine. So while we may like it, the question is, are they willing to index that or not? So that's how I would start. Do some tests, demonstrate that it's going to add value, and then slowly start opening it up to additional layers and get that content indexed.
And if you have the ability to do so, adding unique content or a content box to those specific search result pages can be helpful as well. So then it's just not the same thing over and over again. That won't help with the apartment the apartment example that much in terms of amenities variables, but if it's product type, product size, product color oriented, and there are searches for it, sometimes that can be helpful as well. Next question, and the last question, is pretty interesting. So Lori says that she has a business that's based in Michigan, and about 15% of its traffic online comes from Canada. Would there be any point in adding an hreflang for Canada for the US page that's only in English?
No. So that's interesting. Been doing a survey this week on hreflang, and probably 90% of the people responded have a single language site. And Google just answered this: should I use href language? And I've seen this where I've got a single country, single language site, and it's in English only, and then they say, there's 116 href lang tags in there saying this site's for everything. You don't need to, because it is. So first thing, .com is universal. It's not tied to any particular country. So .com makes it global by default. English makes it somewhat global by default. So I would not take that site and put in a reference to CIEN for Canadian English, and then an EN for global English, and then an X default, and then a US EN, because it's really not for that. Naturally, having the EN or no country language designator makes it global, so there's no need to do it. Now, if there was a reason, because you had pricing in Canadian dollars and you cloned the site and made those changes to allow for Canadian dollars, and once you clone it and start targeting Canada aggressively, from America, we don't have to have English and French, but if you were in Canada, you would. I'd be very careful with that. See, it's not going to help you very much or at all tagging that as also a Canadian site, because you get that by default.
Excellent. Thank you very much. For those of you that didn't get your questions answered, we're going to send them over to Bill and do our best. Bill, there's a couple questions about your tools, which I'm sure you'd be happy to answer as well. So that's everything for today on our SEJ Think Tank, Marketing Think Tank webinar. Again, that was Bill Hunt of Back Azimuth. Did I pronounce that correctly, Bill?
Yes, Azimuth. Yep.
Excellent, excellent. And just to let everyone know, we will be releasing the video of today's webinar, and you can also go to our Search Engine Journal SlideShare account and find Bill's slides, because a lot of this was previously also shared during our SEJ Summit in Chicago earlier in the year. So again, thanks a lot, Bill. It's been really a pleasure to have you again, and look forwarding to you being able to join us in the future as well.
Great, thank you.
And thanks, everyone. Just to let you know before we close, there's going to be a quick survey, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.